If your resume isn't landing you interviews, it's not that you lack the talent. It's more likely that instead of helping you find work, your resume is unintentionally working against you. Today, I want to talk about the 10 tiny ways that your resume isn't working for you and what to do instead. Grab your cup of tea and let's dive into it. The research shows that the number of job applications per job is only continuing to rise. So, in an increasingly competitive job market, the tiny details matter when it comes to standing out to recruiters for your next job or your dream opportunity. Mistake number one that you could be making in your resume is that you have a vague value proposition. Your value proposition is the opening to your resume. It is that first paragraph that people see on page one. And you need to make sure that it isn't fluff and it is getting straight to the point. It is the hook of your resume. It's the elevator pitch. So how is it convincing hiring managers that you're the right person for the job? Make sure that you aren't just using fluffy terminology that could apply to absolutely anyone, and that it is clearly unique to you, your experience, and the value that you bring to the role. You want to make sure that in this section you are being clear about your skills that are most relevant to the role, the years of experience that you have had in those skills or related fields as well. You might reference the industries that you have worked in, and if there are particularly big names that you want to drop in terms of organizations that you have been associated with, then this is the place that you can do that as well. This is also the place where you can add a touch of personality into your value proposition. While the rest of your resume might be heavily focused on the technical capabilities and the skills that you bring to the role in a hard skills capacity, you want to make sure that there is an element of your value proposition, while being succinct, that clearly highlights the personal skills that you bring to the role as well. But be really succinct about this, because sometimes I see a lot of people going in the opposite direction and just including soft skills in their value proposition. You want to make sure that the skills that you are communicating in terms of your personality and your soft skills in this section are what you are most reputed for. So what is it that you have most heard from other people that you can highlight in this section? Because that is already your reputation amongst your peers and in your industry. Most of all, you want to make sure that this section of your resume does not read like it could apply to absolutely everyone. You need to read it and feel like this could only be unique to you. You are the only person who has had this experience, and it needs to read that way. Which leads nicely into mistake number two, and that is that you sound like anyone could do your job. You want to develop an achievement orientated resume, and this can sometimes be difficult for people to do because they struggle with this idea of selling themselves. And I was reminded of this when I read the book F Being Humble, and in it, it really highlights that we need to overcome sometimes, particularly in the work context, this inability that we have to sell ourselves in terms of our professional value. And in it, it talks about that we fear sometimes this fear of sounding stupid, when what we actually should be fearing is a fear of sounding generic. And that is what a lot of resumes can do. It can come across as though it is reading like a job description, as opposed to being unique to you and the impact that you have had in a role. So when you are writing your resume and you're writing the highlights of your resume, make sure that you are showing how you have uniquely contributed to a role. What's the impact that you have had? What are the results? And you can use, for example, the STAR method to be able to help you do this. This is where you highlight the situation, the task, the action, and the result. When it comes to the highlights in a resume, I personally like to use elements of the STAR method, or to mix it around in a different sequence through the highlights of a resume, because that means that you can, for example, for some points, highlight the action that was most important at the start of a point, or you can highlight the result that was most important at the start of the point. And it just gives your resume a little bit more of a dynamic feel, and you can spread out some of those numbers and those great results as well. And speaking of numbers, that brings me to mistake number 3, which is that you aren't backing up your claims. It's one thing to make big statements about the skills and capabilities that you bring to a role. It's a whole other to actually provide evidence about those claims. So instead of sounding fluffy, make sure that you are being specific. For example, what was the percentage growth that you helped to drive? What was the increase in dollar value? If you drove a cost saving initiative, what was the cost saving over a particular year or for that project or over the long term? What were the numbers that are going to be most relevant to be able to convince recruiters that you are a valuable addition to their team? And this might not necessarily always relate to numbers, but think about how else you can be specific. For example, if you're referring to the relationships that you have with other people and your ability to connect with teams internally or stakeholders externally, then be specific about what those teams are so people can see that reflected in the equivalent of the role in their organization, or the external stakeholders that they know that that role also has to build relationships with, knowing that you are already capable of doing that as well. Some other examples that might also be an easy win for your resume is referring to, for example, the size of your team that you lead, that you're a part of, or the project team that you look after, for example, or it could also be the size of the budgets that you look after, and you might include a range in that as well to show your diversity across different resourcing. Mistake number 4 that you could be making in your resume is that you lack visual interest. If you have ever been on the other side of a recruitment process, you know that to read every word of every application takes tons of time, lots of discipline, and full concentration, which is why most people instead are actually only skimming resumes, especially in those earlier stages. So you want to make sure that with a skimming recruiter in mind, that you are able to grab their attention to the points that are most relevant and add the most value to your experience. For example, what are the key sections that you can bold throughout your resume or through your highlights? This might be, for example, at the start of bullet points. You're bolding the sections that are going to be most relevant to that point, and doing it at the start of a bullet point, for example, just makes it potentially a little bit neater than doing this throughout the different sentences as well. You might also use italics through your resume, and I would recommend using this very sparingly so that it doesn't create too much clutter in your resume. But there might be elements of your resume where this just helps to create a little bit more contrast to the rest of the content in your resume. You can also use your font choices to create a hierarchy. For example, what fonts are you using to highlight key sections? What is the size of fonts in particular areas as well? And how is this creating a hierarchy to draw attention to the most important aspects of your resume? You also want to add any numbers that you can to your resume. So in the last section that I mentioned about backing up your claims, this is going to help you to quantify those claims. But from a visual perspective, it also just gives the eyes something to land on. So you're making it easier for the recruiter to see elements of value when they are skimming your resume. And speaking of your skimming recruiter, that leads nicely into mistake number 5, which is that you aren't giving your reader space. Now, if you are using just simply the default settings on your Microsoft Word, or if you have a Mac, the Pages documents, then it's likely that these settings are going to create a document that looks really cluttered to a reader, especially a reader that is exhausted from reading a sea of resumes. So you want to make sure that you are thinking about how your resume feels, particularly in terms of the spacing throughout your resume. Little tiny tweaks that you make to the default setting of your resume so that it's not necessarily just a single line space between the various lines and sections of your resume can make a big difference to the aesthetic appeal of your resume, and it can make it a lot easier on the eyes for the recruiter that you are trying to convince. And speaking of convincing your recruiter, mistake number 6 could be that you are using the wrong tense. There are some people that still choose to use a third person in their resume, and the problem that I find with a third person voice in your resume is that it's not taking ownership of your document. It sounds like someone else has written your document, and you don't need to sound like this mysterious character that your recruiter is going to be introduced to eventually. You can take ownership of the value proposition that you are presenting, of the pitch that your resume is making to a recruiter or to a particular organization. Now, you also don't want to necessarily speak in the first person throughout your entire resume as well. You want to be really tactful about the areas that you do this. So the places that you should be ideally speaking in the first person is the value proposition of your resume. You want to add more of your personal voice to that first paragraph of your resume. You also want to speak in the first person for the blurbs for each of your roles in your professional experience. So this is the opening paragraph for those roles, not the highlights within there. For the highlights within there, as well as the skills profile, for example, on page 1 of your resume, you want to make sure that in that section you are speaking in the implied third person. So you're not using I through those dot points, you're using it in the blurbs and your value proposition. Mistake number 7 that you could be making in your resume is that you lack action-orientated impact. You want to make sure that instead of having a resume that is simply full of end results and numbers and stats, that you are actually connecting the dots for the reader as to the actions that you took to achieve that. They are going to be what sells your skills and capabilities. The results is the proof that you were able to achieve something of value as a result of those skills. But you want to make sure that you are connecting those dots to what a role requires to succeed. So while it might be obvious to you what the background of those particular results and outcomes were, you want to make sure that you are being explicit as to the actions you took. So this goes back to the STAR model, for example, and the actions element of that. And a way that you can also make sure that you are presenting an action-orientated resume is that at the start of each of your dot points for your professional experience, the highlights of your professional experience, you are opening each of those sentences with an action-orientated verb. And this is going to be in the past tense for all of the results that you have already achieved, so all of your previous roles and anything that is already past in your current role, and it might be in the present tense for a few things that might still be in progress as well. Mistake number 8 that you could be making in your resume is that your sentence structure is diluting your point. Humans have a primacy and a recency bias, and that means that we remember what we heard first and last most, and everything else in the middle tends to get a little more muddled. So when you are developing the sentences in your resume, make sure that you are putting the most important information either at the start or the end or both positions in those sentences, because they are going to be what gets the most attention, and things that aren't as significant place in the middle. Mistake number 9 that you could be making in your resume is that you aren't speaking your target organization's language. You might have your own preferred terminology, and the organization that you would like to work for likely has its own preferred lingo as well. While you might naturally normally use different references to certain skills or actions or platforms or whatever it is, make sure that you are linking to the lingo that your target organization uses, because this is going to make it much easier for a hiring manager to be able to connect those dots, to see that you are ticking all of the boxes in the job that they are recruiting for. So again, you're doing that mental heavy lifting for the recruiter. And also keep in mind that sometimes the person that is recruiting for a role might not necessarily be the expert in that particular field. They might be, for example, someone who works in the people and culture or the human resources team who is doing the initial recruiting on behalf of another specialized team. And they might not fully understand all of the relevant terminology, but they are referring to the job description that they have agreed upon with that particular team. And mistake number 10 that you could be making in your resume is that you are saying a lot without actually saying anything at all. Don't simply write for the sake of writing. Don't simply fill space for the sake of filling space. Make sure that every word of your resume earns its place on your resume, in every sentence and in every paragraph, because you want to make sure that you are valuing the time of your recruiter, but you're also showcasing your skills, achievements, and impacts. And when you are simply just speaking in fluffy terms, all of that is getting diluted. You could be saying a lot without saying anything. So make sure that you are selling the value proposition for your professional brand with every word. Thanks so much. For more on personal branding, subscribe for more like this, and I'll see you in the next episode.